Holy fuck.
Hell Let Loose Vietnam is a military simulation game set during the Vietnam War, and it has a major identity crisis and a serious problem. It is a Vietnam War game that seems to forget that it's set during the Vietnam War. For anyone watching this and wondering if they should buy the game, I'm not gonna waste your time, and my answer is that if you enjoyed the first Hell Let Loose set during the Second World War, Hell Let Loose Vietnam is essentially just a reskin of the original, and so if you want a different atmosphere and setting, but more of the same gameplay loop under those conditions, then I say go for it. Hold on a minute, I can hear some of you saying before lacing my food, you just said that this game has an identity crisis and a serious problem. So, how are you telling those who enjoy the first Hell Let Loose to buy the sequel? Aren't you contradicting yourself? Shouldn't you shove writhing oysters up your ass? And the answer is no. In fact, quite the contrary. You see, Hell Let Loose Vietnam plays like any other large-scale team-based first-person shooter. You know the drill. Two teams fight over territory, capture points, etc, etc. One team has an AK, the other has an M16, and both sides are just mirrors of each other's weapons and equipment, just with their own little flair for the sake of gameplay balance. And while I do argue that Hell Let Loose is more of a military simulation game, or milsim, rather than a casual arcade shooter like Call of Duty or Battlefield, there are still those out there who label Hell Let Loose as an arcade shooter. The difference between a milsim and an arcade shooter is that the former tries their best to lean into the historicity of the time period, alongside incorporating real-life counterparts in history into the gameplay mechanics and the overall experience, and this comes at a spectrum. While an arcade shooter doesn't care about reflecting real life or history and may co-opt a theme or conflict just as a backdrop. And so if you want a generic reskin of the original Hell Let Loose with a Vietnam War filter, especially if you already consider Hell Let Loose as a franchise to be in the arcade shooter category, then go for it. But at least for me, as I consider Hell Let Loose as a franchise to be in the milsim category, this sequel is a great disappointment because the game barely even tries to lean into the historical time period. Don't worry, I'll explain everything alongside give my own solutions to whatever I criticize, because it is much easier to critique than create. That's why you've got 1,000 film critics for every director. I will divide this video into 3 sections, all building off of each other, and this is not a sponsored video. Yes, I was invited to an early playtest where I got this footage, which I do appreciate, but this has zero bearing in making me biased to glaze the game. And so let's start with the identity crisis. While I am not, nor do I claim to be a game developer, the setting of this sequel seems to be an afterthought. It literally feels like one day in an office somewhere, some suits got together and said, this Hell Let Loose game is a great big success. How do we replicate it? And instead of a bunch of people actually interested in history bursting at the seams to suggest some underrepresented theater or conflict, the board said, well, we did World War II, everybody knows World War II, so what's some other historical conflict that has mainstream history bro appeal and that we can appeal to as many people as possible regarding the setting with as little friction as possible? How about the Vietnam War, or Resistance War Against America from the Vietnamese perspective? Sure, there have already been previous games covering this conflict in many movies and media, and sure, there are so many other underexplored historical conflicts that we could choose, but hey, we're a business after all, so nothing wrong with choosing a more mainstream conflict. Okay, so how are we going to separate us from the competition? Nothing. I'm not joking. I quite literally can't think of a single feature in Hell Let Loose Vietnam that reminds me that this game is set during the Vietnam War, other than the visuals. Okay, fine, you have this feature where, as the NVA, you can build tunnels and connect them to traverse through the map and theoretically pop up behind enemy lines, and by traverse, I mean there's a cutscene that plays. You can't actually crawl in the tunnels, which is something that has already been done in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, which came out in 2017, except unlike that game, which has punji traps, a feature where if you sit in a bush as the Vietnamese, you become invisible to enemy radar, and much more, Hell Let Loose Vietnam has added, in respect to the setting it takes place in from a gameplay perspective, nothing. Literally nothing. Oh look, you get an anti-personnel mine as the Vietnamese, and you also get them as the Americans. The Americans get a tank, and so do the Vietnamese. And the entire game plays out like 2 evenly matched forces regarding firepower and material conditions, slugging it out. Other than the tunnel feature I mentioned, which has already been done before, the Vietnamese faction don't have to lean into the less conventional tactics or anything regarding more improvised improvised or hasty measures, you don't feel like the underdogs. And yes, before anyone says that, I know that the People's Army of Vietnam, or the NVA, was a professional army and they did have a notable structure and organization. They were still at a material and firepower disadvantage, which you do not feel in this game. Hell, I don't even think the Viet Cong are in this game, at least not at the time of me recording this. The Vietnamese don't get special abilities or traps. The maps themselves are fine. The gameplay loop is more of the same of the first game, but if you're looking for some tunnel rat action or just some gnarly Vietnam War exclusive experience, then there's nothing there. So what you get is the most generic feeling quote-unquote Vietnam War game that you can reskin to pretty much any other shooter set during a conventional conflict and you wouldn't even notice the difference other than the obvious visuals. Where is the creativity? Where is that love for history? I assume someone in the studio is interested in the Vietnam War, right? This feels like you got a bunch of people with zero interest in history, this conflict, or setting in general, and popped in a bunch of Vietnam War films to learn about this conflict and then called it a day. Like when those rat bastards quote-unquote researched the live-action Mulan movie by just walking around in a museum and meshing together a hodgepodge of whatever the fuck they remembered. Vietnam War, napalm, right? Vietnam, jungles and shit and helicopters. That's what this game feels like, a history bro's interpretation of the Vietnam War. If you wanted a peer-to-peer or near peer-to-peer forces going at it in your game, why did you pick the Vietnam War? There are so many other historical time periods to explore that would fit that vision better. This game wants to be set in the Vietnam War for mainstream appeal, since it's less risky than making a Hell Let Loose second Sino-Japanese War. Actually, I take that back. That would have been fucking awesome. The setting alone would make you stand out from most games that have immediate marketing intrigue. You can still have jungles in southern China, and at least two conventional forces directly fighting over territory would make more sense. My point is that at least from the product I see, the people behind Hell Let Loose Vietnam don't seem to be actually interested in the setting and just chose it because it's a safe bet to set a game in. And sorry for anyone watching this on the dev team that's actually interested in the time period, but I just can't see any passion for this time period coming out in the final product. What this means is that this is a Vietnam War game only in name, as it distances itself from much of the historical and military context that made the conflict unique. And this leads into the core problem. Hell Let Loose Vietnam was not designed from the ground up to be a Vietnam War game. No better is this shown than the game modes, which, whether they be warfare, domination, offensive, or whatever, are two sides fighting over direct control over some kind of territory or control point. Before I go on, I'm not saying that these game modes are bad or can't exist, and Rising Storm 2 also had game modes where you fought over territory, although that game is almost 10 years old, and I do expect a game coming out in 2026 to add something new to this setting gameplay wise. Forgive me if my demands are too harsh. The issue is that Hell Let Loose Vietnam, a game set during the Vietnam War, a war in which the majority of the fighting took place in South Vietnam, never mind the search and destroy missions and the guerrilla warfare, which I'm sure is one of the first things someone thinks about when it comes to this conflict. So why in the hell are the game modes for this new game in this new unconventional setting just an overhaul from the first game set during a conventional conflict? This is not World War II. Surely if this game was designed from the ground up to revolve around this conflict it's based on, we would have at least one game mode that reflects this time period, right? This is the core problem, that the entire game is built on a foundation that puts the actual Vietnam part of the title as an afterthought. You have American players sitting in bushes ambushing the Vietnamese because their uniforms actually camouflage better in this game in most maps because the NVA clothing is just naturally much brighter. And since the Vietnamese aren't given any special abilities that make them better at ambushing and staying stealthy, other than a hit or miss tunnel mechanic that has already been done before, this all together leads into one of the strangest Vietnam War game experiences. You have tanks on both sides dueling like it's the Battle of Kursk. You have infantry on both sides engaging in full-on direct assault, not even trying to incorporate some sort of more guerrilla or unconventional tactics. What am I playing? What was even the vision for this game? I get that the original Hell Let Loose had a format that worked, but then why does this game even exist if you're not going to lean into the time period at all, other than making money? Now, I know that I've said a lot and sound harsh, but I also want to provide my own potential solutions so that I'm not armchair generaling the game development too hard. And so here are the potential solutions. Right now, it feels like the dev team went, here are the maps and modes for the first Hell Let Loose that the players enjoyed, so how do we make it Vietnam War themed? Instead, the question should have been, how can we give the players an experience that reflects the time period we are choosing to set our game in while still being fun and part of the franchise. The first change I suggest is making the maps lean way harder into the Vietnam War setting. Instead of a crash helicopter here and a village sprinkled in there, how about an expanse of underground tunnels and outposts that both sides have to fight over, with the Americans entering as tunnel rats with satchel charges to seal off entrances, while the Vietnamese have to keep the Americans out and protect their central command or risk losing important respawn points. Or a game mode built from the ground up like Search and Destroy, except the target is to eliminate, I don't know, 3 Vietnamese outposts that can be hidden above or below ground, and it is up to the American players to traverse through dense jungles and enter tunnels to win their objective. The Vietnamese side has 10 minutes before the game starts to fortify their positions and set down traps, while the Americans can plan their attack routes and choose whether or not to enter by land or air, etc, etc. Or maybe another game mode called LZ Defense, where Americans have 2 to 3 landing zones that they get 10 minutes to fortify and defend from Vietnamese counterattacks, sort of like in the movie We Were Soldiers. The Americans need to defend their little pocket and survive a timer while being airdrop supplies to fortify their position as time goes on. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese get access to heavier weaponry as time goes on, simulating the arrival of reinforcements and movement of equipment. Imagine both sides in a desperate last stand scenario depending on the game mode. Imagine the LZ Defense game mode turning night halfway through and flares being shot in the air while the darkness allows the Vietnamese forces to creep up. Imagine the terror as players find themselves potentially inches away from the enemy and in the dark and have to resort to melee weapons. Or perhaps another game mode where the Vietnamese have to simply fortify and defend a single stronghold with a tunnel network underneath, and the entire game is just a siege scenario essentially, simulating Americans fighting a Vietnamese fortress that they have to enter and clear. I'm just spitballing here and I have no idea how feasible this is to create from a game development standpoint, but don't those ideas sound way more interesting and historical than 2 sides fighting in direct combat over capture points? Beyond the game modes, give the Vietnamese side punji traps, a human bomb grenade vest to use against enemy armor in desperate cases, give them the ability to physically dig tunnels and other defensive points, camouflage their uniforms, allow their footsteps to be quieter than their American counterparts, maybe even remove the tank from the Vietnamese side, or at least make it so that the Vietnamese can't go materially toe-to-toe against the Americans, forcing the Vietnamese side to lean more into their unconventional tactics. The possibilities are endless. And also, just because we are on suggestions, the sound and visuals of Hell Let Loose Vietnam is underwhelming. Not game-breakingly bad or anything like that, but the explosions and sound of bullets flying by is just flat. Now, those are minor things that can be fixed relatively easily, or at least so I think. There are a lot of things that cut out from what I wanted to say. I'm not trying to be mysterious or anything, but as the game just came out, I want to give everything else more time to digest and just see where the game goes. And so while I'm cutting this video short in lieu of seeing how this game will evolve and update as the time goes on, hopefully actually leaning more into the Vietnam War aspect of things, I will still have an eye on this game. Thank you for watching and making it to the end. Like and sub for more. And if you're new to my channel, I primarily play milsim games, but I also make plenty of content on some other stuff that I hope you do check out. But hey, I appreciate you making it to the end. I hope you have a wonderful day.